Welcome to More Than Renovating, a renovate and real estate podcast. Our founder, Belinda Smith, talks to industry experts to provide you with the knowledge and information you need to make renovating for love and profit your reality. Belinda will also chat to some of her Renovation Mastery members, who are just everyday people doing extraordinary things, following their passions in the renovation and property space. So, let's jump straight into the episode. Enjoy.
Hi everyone, I'm Belinda Smith from Renovate and Real Estate, as you well know, and in today's episode, our More Than Renovating podcast, I bring to you John Fung. John is Domain's Chief Commercial Officer and Managing Director, Agent Experience. I know I've got that title right. Officially named as one of Australia's top 50 real estate influencers for 2023. John, you've worked with Google and Uber in the US for 15 years. You were instrumental in the overhaul of Domain app and is part of the team behind Domain's advertising campaign featuring Rose, Byrne and Bobby Cannavale. Those ads are so funny to watch. Look, personally, you've amassed more than 20 properties over your time as an investor, so I'm really excited to have you on, and we'll talk all things property and all things growing portfolios today.
Thanks, Belinda.
You.
Much appreciated. Thank you for having me on. You do such a wonderful service to mums and dads around Australia. And that's obviously what we're trying to do at Domain as well. So great to be part of this movement of inspiring confidence together. And thank you for having me on.
Oh, no, you're so welcome. Let's start right at the beginning.
Yeah.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up actually just around the corner from where I am right now in Gordon. For those of you not part of Sydney, that's part of the North Shore of Sydney. My parents migrated. My dad's from Malaysia. My mum's from Hong Kong. They migrated in the 70s, and me and my sister were born shortly thereafter around here. And I had a very, very lucky and lovely childhood growing up on Sydney's North Shore. So that's where I am today, and that's where it all began. And actually, that's where I'm here now after a long stint away, which I'll talk about later. We've now moved back here. My parents are still in Gordon, and we're living in Pymble, which is the adjacent suburb.
Yeah. What did they do when you were growing up? What did your mum and dad do? Because quite often I find that mums and dads and what they do and what they're involved in has a big impact on kids and what we end up doing.
Yeah, my mum was a nurse and she was very much a carer. She worked full time. My granny was really one who raised me. She was at home. That's my dad's mum. She came over from Malaysia shortly after I was born. And then my dad started off as an information systems auditor, working at some of the big banks, and ended his career as a real estate agent working in Gordon. So that's how I got a bit of the property influence. He was I would say an average, he'd call himself a real estate agent, but he was a very good property investor. And that's where I think a lot of my family learned our craft.
And saw that property investing is possible from wherever you start.
Exactly. I mean, he came over, in the 70s, as I was saying, there is, to make, I guess, some generalizations about the culture which he came from. That part of Malaysia, this is the Malaysian Chinese is the ethnicity of which he came from. There are some very strong property beliefs in that group, I'd say. And that's quite predominant, well, not just within Southeast Asia, but certainly that has led to actually some of the Chinese bubble that they've had, which we can talk about as well. But, there's a lot of Asian belief around that saying of, safest houses.
Safest houses, yeah.
Safest houses. And even as soon as he got into Australia, he went from being probably in the middle to upper class of Malaysia to being smack bang in the middle class of Australia. As soon as he had any income, he turned that into property investing from about the time I was born. So this is a long, long time ago. And he just kept trying to accrue properties and learn about the markets as best he could. And then when he became a real estate agent, he really doubled down on that and just focused full time on that. So that's very much, I guess, his cultural background and how it led him to a lifetime investing in property, not even just when he was a property professional.
Yeah, I think property investing is something that we don't turn off. I think that once you're involved and you've done the research and you've got your knowledge together a little bit and it's interesting and we learn and we grow and we can continue doing it well into our 60s, 70s and really beyond. There's nothing stopping us. Except for the banks when you ask for a 30-year loan and you're already 80. But then there's other ways. All right. So can you share with us the story of your first property investment?
Thank you for asking, Belinda. So as I shared before, I obviously lived with my parents and my granny was the one who was the strongest influence on me. And I had never thought much about property investing, even though that is how my father had, conducted our finances. When I was in my kind of late teen years, my granny was very influential in really nagging me to save up for a property. And she
Yeah.
said, John, as soon as you got an income, you know, as soon as you say a deposit, I'm going to help you with that deposit. We're going to buy a property. We're going to buy one. Don't know what it is. Don't know where it is. We're going to buy a property. And I was fortunate when I was 18 and I graduated high school that when I was entering university, I was on a scholarship. So actually I had an income that was coming in. And so I had an income that we could borrow against. I'd had not a lot of money, maybe $5,000, $10,000, which was, what I was worth at the age of 18. My
Yeah.
granny was happy to pour in some more money that she had saved on the side. And with that, 15, 20 grand deposit, that was more than enough required to buy a $60,000 apartment, in the city, Sydney, near the university. So that was mine. It was a small studio apartment for students around the university areas. And it was kind of pretty low cost. It was high cash flow. It was pretty secure. And that really got me on the ladder and that got me hooked.
It got you started, got you hooked. And so what is your basic, I'll say, thesis behind investment? Is it buy, accumulate some kind of equity in that property? Is renovation part of your strategy anywhere? Like,
Sure.
how do you kind of, build one property from the next?
Sure. And let me break it down because I think my property investing strategy is part of the overall family finances.
Yeah.
I said before, we've got a young family, so we think a lot about these things nowadays.
Yeah.
And I think our strategy is we want to make sure that we have enough to provide for our family today and the opportunities we want to give our children, number one.
Yeah.
Number two, we do want to make sure we have some liquid assets in case of something problematic happening. And when I say liquid assets, something where you could raise, potentially $100,000 more if there's a significant medical emergency, or I have to work, or, who knows what might happen from an economic point of view. Apart from that, we put everything else, given that we'd like to think in the first half of our lives, we want to put as much as possible into assets which may be high risk but high return.
Right.
Not that I think property is necessarily high risk, but after leverage, it becomes higher risk. But
Yep.
that's how I think about it. So that's how, part number one, that's how I think about finances as it pertains to work and life.
Yep.
And so as you accumulate more wealth and more income, you get the privilege of being able to put more into property investing. And so my strategy has been, and I guess I've been fortunate because even when I was younger, even though I did not have much income, I was living at home with my parents. Everything I could, I was saving.
Yes.
Right. And so my attitude has been to maximize leverage. There's a few beliefs behind that. One belief is that if I have structured my day-to-day expenses properly and I have some liquid assets in case of emergency, then I'm fairly safe. Right. So if I can pour everything else into property investing, which has got a long-term horizon, I want to leverage that as much as possible. So I'll try and borrow 60, 70%. And
Look,
then, go for it.
No. I love everything about that. And I think that that's a very sensible way of growing a great portfolio. And I really love the way that you have mentioned that you kind of tuck some aside, or you make sure that you've got something liquid in case something comes up. I think that's very important. And I also love the way that you actually express that you push it a little bit when it comes to being highly leveraged on occasion. So the same with us. There's that point where, and I think it happens with renovators a lot too, where
totally.
There's that one point where you've bought a property, you've thrown all of your cash into that property to renovate that property. You're sitting with a lot of debt at that point. A lot of people, if they're doing borrowing to do it all. And that's the point where people feel a little bit nervous, but trusting in the process and trusting in the product means that you can either sell, or you've got that equity that you can borrow against and go again in some way. And some people are just uncomfortable with the whole property investing thing, but I've seen so much wealth created by just using that strategy.
Yeah, I think there's an important principle here. And again, I think I want to caveat, we all have our different experiences. I have, my parents were very wise in trying to, do the hard work to create a safe upbringing for me and my sister. And we have never experienced what my grandparents experienced of like hardship or wars, or even that feeling like, oh, will we be able to kind of eat enough? Like it's just such a foreign feeling. So the statements I make come from the natural bias I have, whereas other people have different learned experiences, different fears. But generally, human psychology is to overestimate loss, or it's called loss aversion, and under-realize how much upside there is. And I think there's very few areas like that in property. In property, we always think, oh my goodness, what will happen to the property market tanks? And the reality is like, it really goes down more than 10%. It really does. And even it does, it's not like you actually need to cash up, there and then, right? You only actually realize that loss if you have to sell the property. And we typically underestimate those gains. I mean, since COVID, like property prices in the city up 30, 40%. like just these staggering amounts. And that's the difference between kind of in the market and not in the market. So we tend to underestimate those gains and our share of those gains. And we tend to be over fearful of the downside. And that's why, if you have the gumption to invest in the long term, I can't tell you what property prices will be in the next year. I mean, we have a forecast at the mate, but I can't tell with certainty. I can tell you with almost absolute certainty that in 10 years' time, city property prices will probably up somewhere between 50 and 100% and maybe more. If you can wait me by at the top of the market, you look at the top of the market, even after 10 years' time, you've gotten good returns in good capital cities. And we tend to underestimate how certain some of those long-term gains are.
And I truly believe that when people are comfortable just doing their day-to-day, they're comfortable in their safety bubble, going to work, coming home, being able to manage the bills, or maybe, if they're struggling a little bit, they're just getting by okay. And so reaching out or stretching those boundaries to go and invest in something, it's difficult for some people. So I understand it. I talk to people a lot about how that feels, and some people never ever do it. And when they don't do it, I get really disappointed because I see the gains that have occurred in the last few years. And I've been in this for a long time, and those gains occurred in the late 80s, they occurred in the early 2000s. So there's always been times where property's just gone a bit nuts. And when you've got multiple properties and they're all going up by that same amount, that's when people who are brave enough to invest at a higher level, they really win.
No, I totally agree, Belinda. I think a few of the phrases come to mind that we've got a bunch of young kids and we're kind of showing them. Like, I think one is, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you always get, right? And it's that very difficult notion of, man, like I'm in this grind, I'm barely got enough money to pay my expenses. How could I do anything different, right? How can I do anything? And it's hard to shape that. But if you stay in that mindset, you'll never accrue much more than your superannuation. And so the other saying that comes to mind is, and we talked about this a lot when I was a consultant, it's better to be dumb, lucky capital than smart labor.
Yeah.
I'll say that because it's a bit confusing.
That's so true. Yeah.
It's better, if you're really smart, you'll earn a good wage and people pay you, but you're not going to make tons of money. You put in the bank and you might earn a bit of interest. But even if you're not that smart, if you invest that capital and you are not even that lucky, but just give it time, those are the richest people in the world, and those are the people who have ends well beyond their means, and that's a lot of the trick. And as you say, you've had the privilege of doing this for decades, and as a result, every time that market goes up, you're getting those returns in the same way that someone who's a very smart, hardworking wage earner is maybe getting a few percent more salary, but not getting the tens and hundreds of percent of leveraged property.
Oh yeah, the word leverage is it's a beautiful word, John. Beautiful word. So where has all of your property investing, growing and knowledge and all that kind of stuff led you career-wise? Like, how's it participated in your interest?
Yeah, so I'd say two different ways. I shared a bit about my background. That was my first property. Over the next, basically, there was about 7 years when I started uni to when I left Australia. I accrued about, I think, 15 properties in that time in Australia. And the thing that gave me, because I was very lucky then, this is late 90s, early 2000s, I was very lucky that there was a lot of capital appreciation at that time in the place I bought, like Perth and Cairns and things like that. That labeled me to consider things that I would never have considered if I had not invested in property. And by far the biggest one of that was doing an MBA at Stanford in the USA. An MBA at Stanford, the actual cost of the fees is about 150,000 Australian dollars.
Yeah.
You probably need to double that for living expenses. So it's about $300,000.
Yeah.
It is a staggering amount of money. It's almost an 10 amount of money. If I said to you, like, you can get to any university in the world, in any course, you just got to pay for it. Most people go like, I'd love to do it, but I just can't do it. I just cannot afford that. And it so happens that even just that 5 or 6 years of investing, I had made a capital gains in excess of that. And so it allowed me to pretty confidently take a leap and go, well, I don't want to borrow to do an MBA, which I probably would have anyway, in retrospect, but I've got the money to do it. I mean, that was an amazing thing that if I had not invested in property, I would have probably been too scared. How could I, how could I like go into debt $200,000 for a degree where I don't want to go? So I would say that property investing gave me a lot of safety, not even just with that, but after my MBA, like I got this interesting offer to join a small company called Google,
Tiny, you said of Google.
So this is 2006. So it wasn't actually that big, right?
Wow.
And then, in Ireland, like it's kind of just random stuff, right? And like, again, if I was in the like, oh, geez, I don't have a safety net. I've got to get back. I've just spent a few $100,000, which I had, and now I'm back to zero. I got to go. I think it wasn't those properties cooking in the background. I'd probably be a bit more like, oh, okay, I've got to like get back to earning money, get back on the treadmill, none of these grand plans, get back to Australia and get doing it. But it enabled to take a lot of risk with my career. And you work for a company like Google in places like Europe and Silicon Valley, you get like 3 or 4 years of experience crammed into one. Just like leverage and
I agree.
property, like learning. And so if it wasn't property investing, I don't think I would have had the gumption to take those risks. And it's because of those risks that I was actually able to come back in Australia, and even have the audacity to apply for a job like chief commercial officer. And I get to lead 500 people. It's such an important company in Australian property. I had both the experience of having done that at Silicon Valley companies for a decade, but also now that real estate investing experience, that really came together and made this the perfect job for me. So many ways that initial property investment that I spoke about has kind of seeded both family and career moves.
Open up doors. And so when did you meet your partner and all that kind of stuff along that journey somewhere? And is your partner is interested in property investing and you encourage each other?
That's right.
As a couple?
Thank you for asking. So, graduated from Stanford 2007, spent 6.5 years in Ireland with Google. Google called me back to the mothership and said, look, you're leading a global team, come move to Silicon Valley. I was ready for the move. So moved back to San Francisco. My wife is a California girl. She grew up in LA, did her graduate studies in Boston, but her family is also in San Francisco. So 2013, we'd both moved back. We didn't know each other, and online dating had just started to hit mainstream. It wasn't as mainstream as now, but it wasn't weird, back then. So, we met online, which is now, I guess, how most people meet. Found out we had a lot of friends in common, things in common. So met in 2013, 2014, and got married the year after. So she's amazing. Her family, actually, they're Taiwanese American, but her mother was actually also a real estate agent, and they've done very similar things to my parents. They invest in property since they migrated in the 80s. So very, very, very similar background. We have very similar both finance and property, values, which is very helpful in a marriage.
So you're very much aligned, which is very helpful. Okay, so what problems did you come across when you were accumulating your properties, if any?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many problems, right? And I think that's probably
Don't tell anyone.
Well,
maybe I shouldn't have asked the question.
I say that actually because that's why it's so important to start early.
Yeah.
You will have problems, but just like Malcolm Gladwell talks about outliers, mastery comes from repetition, and repetition just comes through time. So the longer you live with these things, the better you get, right? And so for me, I would say most of my initial problems, there are some tactical problems, like literally, how do you buy? What property management do you use? What's the smart way to navigate a bank? And in the end, you do smart things like you get all your loans with the same mortgage broker, right? Who can give you a bit of leeway and there's just a faster speed and you can move quicker. You try and manage all your properties with the same property manager. You get a better deal, you get higher trust, you become more important to them. You try and geographically cluster. So you're not doing, back in the beginning, we kind of spread, right? A few in Perth, a few in Cairns, Gold Coast, and then you realize
spreading the risk, they used to call that.
And there's logic to it.
Like
diversifying with a share portfolio, diversifying geographically with property is bricks and mortar. It's a lot of traveling, it's a lot of work. I was very fortunate my dad could do a lot of that travel. Unless you're like retired and you just want to kind of bounce around and do that, like that's costly, right? That's costing you time you could be spending doing research or something else. So I'd say you learn a lot of those, let me call them tactical lessons. I think the important thing for me, the issue, I would say the problems was actually around my investment choices. And early on, we had a philosophy around looking at there's the magazines back then, looking for the high growth areas where you could be cash flow positive from day one.
Correct.
And, going in there with a highly leveraged path. And that actually meant that you tend to buy a lot of cheap properties. So my first properties I bought were they cost like $100,000, like in Cairns or Perth, right? And that's not nothing, right? But that's probably the equivalent of, $800,000, $900,000 property today, right? So, which is, it's not very, sorry, I should say about a $500,000 property today. So these are not top of the range properties. They're okay. And a lot of the areas we ended up buying were a bit on the edges. There were a lot of, for example, folks who might have been on welfare or folks who did not have secure employment. And again, that is a legitimate investing strategy, and you can get high returns for higher risk there. We found we actually really did not like that for two reasons. It actually made a lot of the property management very awkward. We actually did not feel I would say physically safe in some of the areas that we were investing in. That was one.
Yeah.
And secondly, you just introduce a lot more risk, right? So for example, we made a lot of investments around the General Motors Holden factories outside of Adelaide. And they fit the docket we were going for: 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, $100,000, an employment base. But it was risky, and it was risky that if that factory shut down, which it did, then basically you can kiss goodbye to your capital gains for
yes, you and every other investor in the area too.
yeah, right. So I think where we've come to that philosophy over the course of a decade, that the problem, as you say, you asked about, that developed a philosophy for us of actually we're just going to try and buy in premium areas.
Yeah.
Which means we can't buy as much, which means maybe limit some of our returns because they're not going to like triple overnight or something like that. But it does mean that we'll probably feel safer. We can relate to it more. And we have probably a greater guarantee of a sustainable return, which is still 7% compounded per year. Like it's meaningful. And to me, that's the difference between like investing in a Sydney, or maybe a rural area. You got to find your own fit. And that to me was a lot
have to find your fit. Yeah, I agree. I see people playing extremes, doing one way or the other. So some people will chase consistently positive cash flow properties and they don't care where they buy, and so the capital growth, they kind of suffer that way. And I see other people get very tangled up in highly negatively geared properties, hanging on, praying to goodness that they go up enough before they sink. So I really like a mix or a blend, or at least recognizing what sort of property should come next in your own particular portfolio, and everyone can make their own choices.
Yeah, and it's really changed, right? As we've gotten, as our family needs have changed. Back in the day, I was, happy to take lots of risk, and we were learning. When we moved to America, and I shifted a lot of those investments to America, we actually decreased quantity and increased quality.
Yes.
And part of that was we wanted to buy near the area we're living in, Silicon Valley, and that's just a much more expensive place relative to the rest of America. And then we came back to Australia, because of the way taxation laws work in Australia, there's obviously no capital gains in your primary residence. We said, okay, we're going all in, on our investments, right? Yeah. Again, I'm not saying that's the right thing, but our approach, that mix you talk about, shifted, and it will shift again as we, get older and have different investing needs.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I really like you recognizing the quality PPR is a tax-free investment. Renovating your PPR is even a better way of growing the value fast.
Ultimate house hack.
Yeah, the ultimate house hack.
Exactly.
All right. So what's your favorite property out of all of the ones that you have? What did really well for you, or what do you still have that you really love?
I'd say I'll say the favorite property that we have is our current house. Part of it is like, I feel
mine too.
And I think I'd love to always feel that way, but I think we feel very lucky to be able to buy back in Australia near where our family live. I mean, it's a privilege I don't take for granted, and I'm very grateful for it. So that's probably in terms of the favorite property. In terms of investment, it actually is probably the first family home we bought when we were in Silicon Valley. So we had just got married. We were living in San Francisco City, and then where I was working, Google is in the suburbs. It's near Stanford. Google, Apple, Facebook, these are all in places like Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Cupertino are some of the names you might have heard. So we were looking to buy close to there, and we were able to buy a property in Los Altos, which is, very close to that whole area. And I really love it because what happened from an investing point of view is we bought this home. We loved it. It was a 4-bedroom house. It was a 4-bedroom house. It was lovely. It certainly met our needs for that then, which is no kids, lots of renovation potential. It wasn't a top property. It was a great, wonderful property for newlyweds to have. And what we were able to do is transition that from being a primary residence to an investment property, when our family grew and we wanted to make different decisions. And to me, that wasn't even necessarily how we planned it. But I would say that is a pattern I've seen for many folks, both in Australia and America. When you're able to do that, apart from some of the capital gains taxation advantages, you actually find yourself in this position where in a sense, it's still cash flow positive, even years after, the price have gone up and things like that. And it's just one of those things where it's like, it's nice. You still own it. You will have love for it. Now someone else can love it too. You got to make sure that you can detach a little because it's
I was going to say there's an emotional attachment right there.
But in terms of like the most efficient taxation investment, assuming you're buying a good area and you bought a good house, and if you renovate, it's even better. That's something we're really, really grateful that it worked out that way.
What's next on your list? Like if you had to pick a favorite type of property, whether it be commercial or residential, or can you describe what will be the next one in your portfolio?
So it's an interesting question because we're at the stage of life where we are not looking to invest. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean by that. I'm very fortunate to have
no. I'm a bit further down the track than you, and I understand.
Well, I hopefully it'll change again, but our current state is currently this, right?
Yeah.
Like, I have a wonderful job, and we're fortunate to have, still a lot of these residential properties or these investment properties that we've accumulated over the years. But, from a cash flow point of view, we spend a lot of money. We have 3 young kids, one of them just started school this year. There's a lot of things to pay for. We obviously want to give the best that we think our kids deserve or need. And so that if you translate that, it's like, oh, actually from a expenses and cash flow point of view, this phase may be amongst the worst in my life. Whereas up until this point in time, we're actually been cash flow positive, right? So what happens there is it's less about, okay, great, I'm saving up, and then I'm going to buy something, right? This is more about, oh, okay, like this is the stage to hold on, let the capital gains of what you've got, continue. And then when something happens, maybe, you get a promotion at work or maybe something changes or the market changes, then you look to change again. So I would say one part, previous to my earlier remarks, life stage is very, very important. Yes. And I'm not necessarily saying you should be investing all the time, though I do think that you should be invested all the time. That is, you should be, I would always be holding as many investments as opposed to cash in bank as I could.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think when the time comes, I am excited to get back into property. I think there's a world where we actually just try and increase the value of our primary residence from a taxation point of view. I think the other remedy would be to look for something that has both functional and investment potential. That could be, an investment property in an area we like to travel to, for example. But we're relatively far from making any of those decisions.
Yeah, I love pausing. I see people frantically going at things, and I think there is a time to sit back and have a look at where you're at and just pause and take a breath and make every move a really good strategized move.
Yeah.
Long-term goals? Any goals? I shouldn't say this when we're about to talk about your work and all that kind of stuff. When's retirement? You're not allowed to say next month. Someone's going to hear it and report to the boss.
I'm really grateful that I'm in a job that I guess it's a bit of a
love.
I'd probably do it for free.
Yeah, me too.
It's what I do. So much fun. I learn so much.
And I think there'd be nothing worse than being bored. I pick up a paintbrush any day.
I know.
Run around and find something to do.
Once you're bored, you die. That's the problem.
That's true.
Don't get bored.
Okay, so in closing, John, if there was one little piece of advice you'd like to give anyone who's about to start their property journey, what would that be?
I think the overwhelming thing is start early. Yeah. Whether that's investing, whether that's buying your first house, whether that's renovating what you have, the earlier you can start, number one, the more capital gains you will have, because there's a huge difference between investing for 1 and 2 years and 10 and 15 years. Yes. That extra year or few years at the end, that's where you're getting all the returns, right? Yeah. So that's the first thing I'd say. Start early from a purely financial point of view, but as I said, start early from a learning point of view. You will absolutely make mistakes. You'll actually look back and go, well, I would have done something differently if I was starting today. And you only get that privilege of doing that if you start early, because if you start late, then you feel like you can't make mistakes. If you think you can't make mistakes now, you definitely feel you can't make mistakes in 5 years' time when the stakes are high. So number one, start early. But I think for that reason, get really good advice. Yeah. Even though most property on average, compounds at, well, most houses in Sydney compound at 6 to 7% over a 10-year period. If you take any 10-year period of the last 100 years, there are houses that do better and there's plenty of ones that do worse. So get advice. Like, I'm a huge advocate for buyer's agents. Yeah. Cheap, right? But I think particularly even now, like, I have tons of experience. Me and my wife bought like tens of properties. We absolutely get advice. We get buyer's agents. We get really smart mortgage brokers, people you can trust, to give you counsel. The worst thing you want is you start early and then you make a big mistake and that sets you back. Then you're twice as unlikely to start again and do it later. So try and give yourself the best possible success, but really just try and start.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. Thank you for sharing both your personal insights as well as your property insights in relation to investing, and congratulations on your success, and particularly in working with Domain.
Thanks, Belinda. I appreciate that. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.